Hi, I'm David Crow. Thank you for tuning in to episode 213 of my weekly radio show, The Infectious Myth. Email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. That's Crow with an E. Join the discussion and like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at infectiousmyth. Listen every Tuesday at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on prn.fm or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or other programs. You can listen to any of the last 5 episodes over the phone by dialing the U.S. number 701-719-0990 when following the instructions. Just remember that you will be responsible for any long-distance charges. New this year, prn.fm has voicemail. Call 862-800-6805. And as well as a message or question for the show, leave your name and indicate that the question is for The Infectious Myth. Again, remember that long-distance charges may apply. I don't know that you're a listener till I hear from you, so send me a message letting me know how you stay in touch with the show and what you like about it. If you include your mailing address, I will send you a little thank you gift, which will be one of the bookmarks I make by hand using my own photographs. I do love to hear from you. You can make a one-time donation to the expenses of the show via PayPal using the email david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com or monthly donations at patreon.com/infectiousmyth. We appreciate all our listeners, but if you want the show to continue to grow and improve, consider paying a small amount for the information that you are gleaning, for the support you get for some non-mainstream ideas, and the challenges you get to others. If you would like me to speak at a meeting of an organization you're a member of, on just about any of the topics I've covered in my shows, I'd be happy to discuss this with you. I appreciate you commenting and suggesting guests. I appreciate your financial support as well. Thanks for listening and for recommending this show to your friends. There has been a coordinated effort to force vaccines on the population for the last few years, and it's now reaching fever pitch. Maybe that's a pun. It seems that unless we accept that every vaccine that a drug company can dream up is safe, needed, and effective, we aren't compliant enough. If you complain about too many vaccines, or the danger of giving too many at once, or the danger of giving them to preemies, or pregnant women, or you just don't think measles is a serious enough illness, then you are a denialist. Any deviation from extreme orthodoxy is punishable by being forcibly vaccinated, or worse, watching the state vaccinate your children in front of you because they've brought in mandatory vaccination before school. And this is happening most severely in the country that values freedom above all other countries, the United States of America, or at least that's what they say. While there are probably more vaccine opponents on the right, the vast majority of politicians on the right are in lockstep with vaccine mandates. On the progressive end of the spectrum, this is one place where you can get progressives to fawn at the products of pharmaceutical companies. I don't know why it's like this. There are occasionally articles about bad pharmaceutical drugs, drugs that have caused death and destruction before being pulled from the market, that have generated massive lawsuits. Quite a few articles, for example, mention that the opioid crisis was created by pharmaceutical companies, particularly Purdue. But even with $4 billion in compensation from the US government for vaccine damage, with most vaccine damage never claimed because people don't even know that the vaccine court, the Court of Federal Claims, exists, or because the claims are rejected because the side effect hasn't been seen for that vaccine before, it's becoming increasingly difficult just to talk about simple facts. And the disease that is the poster boy, the poster child for vaccine panic is measles, which is funny because it's one of the most benign. But on the other hand, it's useful because the symptoms of measles still pop up regularly. It's certainly not AIDS or mad cow disease, but then nobody's claiming a vaccine exists for them, although a vaccine was promised for AIDS in 2 years after the announcement that the HIV was the probable cause way back in 1984. SARS was a grand panic for a while, but then it completely disappeared without a vaccine being there to claim responsibility. Nobody wants to claim that Ebola is spreading in the West because that would cause an enormous panic, or Zika. Influenza, well, that has a vaccine, but even every once in a while there are admissions that the flu vaccine is not very effective. They always blame it on it not matching this year's flu. So somehow measles has become the convenient boogeyman to attack vaccine denialists or anti-vaxxers. The CDC admits that the vast majority of cases of measles have no long-lasting effects. And of those long-lasting effects, death is obviously the most permanent and the most obvious. But the CDC does claim that measles has the potential to maim and kill. Therefore, vaccination is worth the effort at almost any cost, particularly if you ignore the risk of adverse events from the vaccine by suppressing people who want to talk about them. So I thought it would be interesting to take the CDC at its own word, to see what the CDC's own documents say about measles, supplemented by other mainstream sources when necessary. So some of the claims are that the proof that measles was caused by an infection, by an infectious blood-borne agent, was demonstrated by Francis Home way back in 1757. Measles became a reportable disease in the United States in 1912, and in the first decade, about 6,000 people a year died from measles. The first vaccine became available in 1963, and this was replaced by the Edmundston Enders vaccine in 1968 that is still in use. In the last decade before a vaccine, that would be 1953 to 1962, about 400 to 500 people a year died from measles, 1,000 got encephalitis, and 48,000 were hospitalized. The CDC also notes that a second measles vaccine dose was recommended after a major outbreak among the vaccinated in 1989. So the claim that Francis Home proved that measles was an infectious blood-borne agent, the proof was demonstrated in 1757, is kind of contradicted by scientific papers that just simply state that Francis Home was the first to study measles. It would be very difficult to prove that a virus was a cause of disease in 1757 when it wasn't possible until the 1930s to actually see a virus. So these proofs usually involve negative evidence. You filter out as much as you can, and back in 1757, what could be filtered out was probably barely filtering out bacteria. And then you can do some experiments that, if you really thought about it in the modern context, you'd realize didn't really show too much at all. But by putting the proof that far back, it's very difficult to actually obtain the data and criticize it. Another thing I would point out with the CDC's own claims is that the requirement for a second measles vaccine dose indicates that vaccination has at least one characteristic that's less effective than natural infection. Natural infection is still believed to confer lifetime immunity. There were some, in 2011, there was a major measles outbreak in Quebec in Canada amongst a mostly vaccinated population, and mostly with 2 measles vaccines. So even 2 measles vaccine doses don't confer lifetime immunity. But still, it's considered better than suffering a disease that has a tiny possibility of death. So let's talk about the risk of death from measles. The CDC, according to the pro-vaccine blog Vaxopedia, says that the last measles deaths were in 2003, but Vaxopedia points out that there have been a few death certificates with measles on them since that time. The author of the blog is an MD named Vincent Iannelli. He counts 11 measles deaths since 2000. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, this is pretty close to zero, so everybody can claim success But at the same time, because it's not zero, there's justification for ensuring that one day it does get to zero. So this is seen as both a huge success for the vaccine because there's so few cases of measles and so few deaths, as well as a failure caused by non-vaccinating people still bringing measles back to the United States. So you can always blame people in Italy or Somalia or somewhere for bringing measles into the US and ruining the hard work that the CDC has done. But anyway, let's go back to the CDC's page and note that what it says is that there were 6,000 deaths per year in the decade following the start of reporting in 1912, but 400 to 500 in the decade before the first vaccine in 1963. First thing I noticed, this is not quite accurate. I actually went to the vital statistics, which are maintained by the CDC. And between 1956 and 1962, the number of deaths oscillated between 380 and 552. It's not a big error, but it just shows how what you're getting from the CDC in these nice, short, neat pages on measles are a simplification of history. So if there were 6,000 deaths in the year, you need to adjust those because the population at that time was smaller. But there's another factor that's probably not obvious. Back in 1912, the United States did not keep death certificates of any kind. Falling off a horse or whatever the death was not counted in a large amount of the United States, mainly areas that were remote and rural. They had good death statistics in the cities and in the suburban areas and in the hinterland, the farms around on the eastern United States, but way out west where there were hardly anybody, or at least hardly any white people, then there really weren't very good death statistics. In 1912, for example, the population of the continental US was 95.3 million, but the population of the death registration area was only 58.2 million, about 58% of the total population. That means you've got to multiply the death rate by about 1.5. But luckily, even back in 1912, the people who looked after vital statistics, it wasn't the CDC because they didn't exist then, did keep track of the death rate. So the death rate from measles in the decade starting in 1912, because there were so many fluctuations, I decided to use a 10-year average. Otherwise, I could have just picked the worst year to prove my point, but I want to be as honest as possible. So the first decade death rate averages to 9.02 deaths per 100,000 per year, or about 1 death out of 11,000 people per year. But in 1953 to 1962, which was the last decade before a vaccine, again, to average things out, the death rate averages to 0.258, or about 1 out of every 350,000 Americans. So the death rate dropped from 1 out of 11,000 people in 1912-ish to 1 out of every 350,000 people in the late 50s, early 60s. How could this be? Maybe it was the incidence of measles. If there were less cases of measles and the death rate stayed the same, then maybe that was the explanation. There was just less measles. However, I went back to some historical documents from the CDC. They have a weekly publication called the MMWR, which is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. Morbidity is just a fancy word for illness, and it allows them to put a little bit of alliteration in their title, a little bit of humor from an otherwise dour organization. So they have a graph, this is their own data, of both the number of cases and the number of deaths between 1912 and 1965, and we'll just look at 1962 because it's the last year without a vaccine. And what you can see is although the rate of cases went up and down significantly every year, there was no downward trend between 1912 and 1962. It's basically a horizontal line, but at the same time, the trend in deaths, as you can tell, from 1 out of 11,000 to 1 out of 350,000 was steeply downwards. Another way to think about it is what percentage of vaccine deaths disappeared before we had a vaccine? Well, 0.258 out of 9.02 is about 2.9%. So in other words, the death rate in the last decade before a vaccine was 2.9% of the death rate in the first decade of monitoring of measles, starting in 1912. That means that 97.1% of the deaths from measles disappeared before there was a vaccine. Now, one possible reason for this is if the number of measles cases reduced dramatically, then you could just say, well, it's just a factor, less cases, less deaths. The CDC has a weekly publication called the MMWR, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. Morbidity is a fancy name for sickness, and it allows the CDC to have a little bit of alliteration in their title, which is a tiny little bit of humor in an otherwise unhumorous organization. So I went back into their archives, and I found a graph from 1966, which showed the incidence, the number of cases of measles every year per 100,000 population, and the death rate. The death rate, as I found from looking at the original statistics, declined steeply between 1912 and 1962, although there were many ups and downs along the way. There's a very, very obvious downward curve. The incidence rate, on the other hand, is flat. The incidence of measles in 1962 was not really any different than in 1912. Again, from year to year, there were big ups and downs. It was very clear from this graph that there was no significant downward trend. Now, one thing, if you ever find this graph, you need to note that it's printed on what they call a logarithmic scale. And what that does is it significantly shortens the higher numbers and dramatizes the lower numbers, which is in the favor of the CDC because they can show a big drop in cases after the vaccine came out, but it's actually trivial. It hides the fact that 97.1% approximately of the deaths disappeared before there was a vaccine. So at best, the vaccine can be credited with about 3%. And there's a nice website called Vaccines Did Not Save Us, which, as you can tell, is put out by, quote, vaccine denialists, that has some more up-to-date graphs that go out into the 1970s. And they've extrapolated with a straight line to show that at the rate of decline from 1912 to 1962, measles mortality would have disappeared in 2010 anyway. Well, it's always dangerous to extrapolate graphs, but I think the major point is that the vaccine cannot take the credit for saving 100% of the deaths. Now, if we go back to Vaxopedia and Dr. Iannelli, he also has a graph on his website, and he uses the arithmetic scale, which is actually more honest. And when you look at that, it's quite obvious that the measles death rate had pretty much flatlined in the 1950s. He makes the point that's still 400 deaths a year. That's still something. That's still significant. And so people who say that's not significant are saying they don't care about 400 people a year. But if nothing had been done between 1912 and 1962, and what was done clearly wasn't a measles vaccine, there would have been 14,000 deaths from measles a year at the same rate of measles deaths. So yes, 14,000 is a lot more significant. Why don't we care about what was saving people from dying from measles in the early part of the 20th century? Why do we only care about the deaths that supposedly have been saved by the vaccine, when in fact, if you're looking at a declining scale, you would have to anticipate that it might continue to decline into the future, even if there was no vaccine intervention, because the other factors that were in place, such as better nutrition, might have been in play after 1962 anyway. And maybe they could take credit for half of the 3%, which would mean that the saving of deaths from measles was 98 or 99% due to non-vaccine causes. Well, let's look at another statistic. Let's not look at measles deaths over the entire population, but let's look at the number of deaths per case. So if you get measles, what is the chance that you would die? Now, there's been a number of recent statements that the risk is reasonably high. One Dr. Natasha Crowcroft of Public Health Ontario claimed that 1 out of every 3,000 or 5,000 children who get measles will die. Robert Bouy, chairman of the Immunization Coalition, which I should point out is funded by vaccine manufacturers GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Sanofi Pasteur, and Seqirus Australia. The Immunization Coalition is in Australia. He ups the ante and says, without a doubt, measles can kill. About 1 in 1,000. That's in Europe as well. The CDC goes even further. 1 or 2 people out of 1,000 who get measles will die, even with the best care. So they're basically saying you can discount care, nutrition, all of these things. Measles has a fixed death rate. But that's obvious nonsense. The US statistics show that the overall measles death rate declined dramatically, while the number of cases, the incidence remained relatively static over the first half and a bit more of the 20th century. This means obviously the risk of death declined dramatically. And the World Health Organization itself gives us some hints. Now, this is a quote from their webpage on measles. Severe measles, and by that I assume severe measles means illness beyond the fever and rash and possibly death. It's more likely among poorly nourished young children, especially those with insufficient vitamin A, or those whose immune systems have been weakened by HIV/AIDS or other diseases. So, in other words, WHO admits that the risk of death is not a single number. It fluctuates with the health status of the person who has measles. So if you're a well-nourished American who gets measles, your chances of death is tiny. But if you're, say, an orphan in a camp in Yemen, in a country hit by war and famine, your risk of death for measles is much, much higher. So to say that there is a single number, 1 out of 1,000, just as a nice round number, which happens to be approximately the death rate in 1962, that is, of the cases of measles that were reported in 1962, about 1 out of 1,000 died. And in the United States, the risk from death fluctuated dramatically from year to year. So, for example, in 1912, 1 out of 44 cases of measles died, but 1 out of 28 in 1913 and 1 out of 55 in 1920. By 1939, it was 1 out of 342, even lower in 1946, 1 out of 552, and in 1958, 1 out of 1472. But then in 1963, the death rate had risen to 1 out of just over 1,000, which is maybe what this Robert Bouy was quoting. But these are comparing reported deaths to reported cases. And here's another really important point. Most measles cases were not reported, and the CDC MMWR admits this, or pardon me, the vital statistics documents admit this, that because it's a relatively mild condition, most cases are never reported. So we can estimate from the under 15 population of the United States, if we assume that pretty much everybody got measles before they were 15 and they only got it once, then we can find out that in 1968, the under 15 population in the United States was about 58 million out of a total population of 186.54 million. So if we divide the 57.9 by 15, because there are 15 years and people would get measles in one of those years, that should be about 3.86 million cases. So the number of deaths in that same year, 1962, was 408, which means that the rate per cases would be one death per close to every 10,000 cases, which is about 10 times higher. So the death rates have to be taken with a grain of salt, maybe multiplied or divided by a factor of 10, depending on which way you look at it. But let's now talk about diagnosis and diagnostic bias. If you, as a doctor, believe that there's a current measles epidemic and you have a patient who has not been vaccinated, you may be more likely to diagnose measles. Conversely, you might find some other diagnosis for a patient with spots and a fever, if that person is fully vaccinated. Our friend Dr. Iannelli at Vaxpedia helps us out here. He investigates a claim by vaccine skeptics that CNN used a photo of a measles vaccine-injured child, as an example of a child with measles. This child is covered with spots. The doctor clarifies that it was actually the CDC that made the mistake, not CNN, but that it wasn't a measles vaccine reaction. It was, wait for it, a smallpox vaccine reaction. The important point is that the CDC could not tell the difference between measles and an adverse reaction to a vaccine, illustrating the difficulty of diagnosing a condition based on symptoms that are found in many other conditions, which also includes exposures to toxic chemicals, such as pesticides. What's really sloppy on the part of the CDC is that the Public Health Image Library, image 13322 if you really care, has a description of this image, and it describes it as a smallpox vaccination reaction resembling measles. So somebody else from the CDC was obviously in a real hurry to get a picture of measles, and picked up a picture of a smallpox adverse reaction. And actually, if you look at this child, you can see a large welt or scab at the site of the injection, which is very red, and then the rest of the body of the child is covered with crusty spots. I don't normally like to talk about my own story, but I think this is one of the rare cases where my story with measles is instructive. It's instructive because it's just so boring. I was born in 1956, if you care to know how old I am. And I, like my brother and sister and all my friends, came down with all the childhood diseases in my first few years of life, which would have been the late 1950s and the early 1960s. My mother is about 90, and she's very sharp, and after this time, not in the 1960s, she trained as a scientist. And so I asked her about what I remembered. I didn't remember going to the doctor, and she confirmed that we never went to see the doctor because she just said she knew measles was not a big deal, so why would you take a child to the doctor? She also knew that measles was a viral infection, and therefore there was nothing that the doctor could do. Luckily, they didn't have antiviral drugs in those days. I'm sure that she would have taken me or my siblings if things had got out of hand. If my rash got worse over multiple days, or if my fever had not broken, whatever. I asked her how she knew at any one point that it was measles that I had and not what we called German measles in those days, now more appropriately called rubella. Maybe it was chickenpox. They all have spots as a characteristic. So she replied that, well, measles was going around then. So other mothers were saying, my kids got measles, and so the knowledge became infectious. I asked her, what if I'd already had measles? Would she have diagnosed me with measles? And she responded the way I thought she'd say it, and said that once you had measles once, you could not get it again. That was well ingrained, even in the 1950s and 60s, that a viral infection was something that you got, and then you got lifetime immunity. So then the question is, well, maybe I was vaccinated. 1963, plausibly, I was vaccinated against measles, which doesn't make much sense because I got measles. So if I was vaccinated, it would be afterwards, but I was interested to know. was I vaccinated? My mother firmly believes in the infectious theory of measles and just about everything else, but she was not by nature an early adopter. And even though she trained as a scientist, she always had a bit of skepticism about doctors and medicine. I remember our medicine cabinet having expired aspirins and expired milk of magnesia, and that was about it, and I guess some Band-Aids. And if I ever asked for an aspirin, I was told that my headache clearly was not bad enough to need an aspirin. So basically, I went unmedicated for the vast majority of my childhood. She said that she saw no need for vaccination because it was such a benign illness, and we'd already had measles by that time, and she knew that we were therefore immune, so she would not have had us vaccinated even if she thought that the vaccine was effective. Even though I was young, I still have clear memories of receiving the oral polio vaccine on a sugar cube. I was quite excited. But I had no recollection of being vaccinated against measles, which I'm sure I would have also remembered. I think when I got the polio vaccine, I might have only been 4 or 5 or 6 years old. It was one of my earliest memories. I also have a vaccination record book from when I moved to Canada in 1966 that has only 3 lonely entries for 2 smallpox vaccinations in 1969 and 1973, and what's a little bit smudged but looks like a combined tetanus polio in 1978. So that is what made me think about how did the government count measles statistics. I mean, even the incredible number of measles cases that they counted, which is maybe 1/10 of the actual number, is kind of mind-boggling in the pre-computer era. How could they? Did they just receive estimates? You know, the school nurse would send an estimate to the local public health official, and the county health official sends it to the state health official, and the state health official send it to the CDC. So you get the nice numbers you want in Washington at the CDC, or I guess Atlanta, and you can put together a nice annual report of measles cases, and yet the numbers might not actually mean that much. If we look at 1962, there were close to 500,000 cases of measles. So how were these diagnosed, and apart from being reported? I mean, did they really do 500,000 measles virus tests? That seems highly unlikely. So even if they were diagnosed by a doctor, it was probably visually. You know, have you received the vaccine? Has this child ever had measles before? Well, this looks like measles. But could it have been that the child had some other disease, or perhaps the child had an adverse reaction to another vaccine, and that some of those were included in the numbers? It's very difficult, if anybody has any information on how they went about collecting 500,000 case reports every year, and that was just for measles. They had many other diseases to look after, although most of them didn't have anywhere near the same number of cases. Following the commercialization of a measles vaccine, first in 1963, generally recognized as a fairly useless vaccine by the people who promote the 1968 vaccine. So then in 1968, there's a new vaccine. Doctors would have believed that vaccinated children were unlikely to get measles, and that unvaccinated children were likely to get measles. And this would have created the bias that I talked about earlier. And what resulted in the statistics was that there was a collapse in the rate of diagnosis of measles. But was this a real change? At this point, it's very hard to say. But we know that even the 1968 vaccine wasn't really that great. The CDC describes the 1968 vaccine as improved and even weaker. It's a strange comment, but I assume that the 1963 vaccine had more biological components and maybe caused more adverse reactions, and the 1968 was a little bit safer, so they went with that. But even the CDC notes that, quote, a 1989 measles outbreaks among vaccinated school-aged children prompted the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the American Academy of Family Physicians to recommend a second dose of the MMR vaccine for all children. By then, the measles vaccine had been replaced by the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. But even this was not enough. I also mentioned earlier that there was a significant epidemic in Quebec, Canada in 2011 in a population of school children of which 97% had one dose of measles vaccine by 28 months and 90% had two doses. And as they noted, vaccine coverage is even higher by school entry. Another interesting thing is that the beginning of the use of the 1968 vaccine, there was actually a surge in measles cases for 1969-70 and 70-71. They reported, the CDC reported, in the measles epidemiological year, 1970 to 71, 77,682 cases of measles were reported in the United States. This represents a 74% increase over the total reported for 1969 to 70, and a 225% increase over 1967-68. The associated graph actually shows that in the peak 4-week period in 1971, about 14,000 cases were reported compared to less than 4,000 during the same period in 1968 and 69. In the Ukraine, there appears to have been an accidental experiment showing an inverse correlation between vaccination and protection for measles. In 2016, due to difficulty obtaining vaccines, vaccination rates were 31%, but there was no measles epidemic. However, after a so-called catch-up campaign in 2017, an epidemic of 12,000 or more cases of measles occurred. This article, an article that I will provide a link to in this article that I've written for you. This article notes that only a minority of diagnoses are based on laboratory tests, most being based on the detection of a rash, fever, and cough, a cold, or red eyes. And again, these are such generic symptoms that it's easy to see that they could lead to misdiagnosis. If you were in the midst of a measles epidemic and somebody came to you with a child with spots and a fever that was caused by something totally different, almost certainly they would get caught up in the diagnosis of measles. Now, I guess my views are not very popular. I posted on Twitter, I think, that the death rate in 1962 was only 3% of the death rate around 1912. And somebody with a Twitter account at Vaccine UK wrote to me, quote, "Your lack of empathy for the remaining 3% of deaths is shocking." At first I thought he was being sarcastic, but then I realized he was being serious. And yes, 400 deaths or 500 or 300 or whatever is still serious, and I would never say that we should stop looking at how to eliminate those deaths. And if I really felt that the vaccine was curing 300 deaths a year, then it would be worth considering. But of course, a vaccine that saves 300 deaths, and at the same time you need to vaccinate millions of people, it's quite easy to see that the safety benefit ratio might be negative. Because if you have to vaccinate millions of people and there is 1 out of 10,000 or 1 out of 100,000 chance of a serious adverse reaction, you could easily end up with more deaths being caused by the vaccine than being caused by the illness you're trying to cure. Even with the small number of deaths, it's possible to see that many of the deaths that have been reported have been in seriously ill people, such as a child with leukemia, for example. So if a child with leukemia gets measles and dies, was it measles that killed them? Was it actually measles? Or did they have an adverse reaction to potent chemotherapy? And the spots were misinterpreted as measles, and all of a sudden, instead of this child was basically killed by chemotherapy, we can say this child was killed by measles. And if the child had not been vaccinated, or maybe couldn't be vaccinated because they'd been a cancer patient for a long time, it kind of transfers the blame away from cancer treatment. According to VAERS, which is the U.S. database of vaccine adverse reactions, there have been 93,203 adverse reactions to measles, to the measles vaccine, and in most cases, the measles vaccine contained other elements, like the MMR, for example. That's over 30 years, so about 3,000 adverse reactions per year. Of those, there have been 459 deaths and 1,526 people classified as disabled, subtracting out the deaths because people may have become disabled and then died. And then there's just over 1,000 classified as life-threatening, and again, subtracting out those who were also classified as disabled or who died. So these are relatively small number of deaths. This would be 15 deaths, 51 disabled, and 35 life-threatening every year, which seems pretty small by comparison to the 400 or so deaths that were remaining in 1962. But it's also reported, it's also believed that in passive adverse event reporting systems like VAERS, only 1 to 10% of adverse reactions are actually reported. So instead of 15 deaths, it could be 150 deaths, or it could be 1,500 deaths, because somebody who dies from a vaccine might not be recognized that it was the vaccine that caused their death. So we really can't say for sure that the death rate from the vaccine is less than the death rate would be for measles. And again, maybe the death rate for measles would have dropped. So now instead of 400 per year, it would have been 200 per year. And so even if the deaths from the measles vaccine were only 150 a year, it's approaching the number of deaths from measles, and then we have to consider all the people being disabled or having life-threatening conditions. So let's talk a little bit about some of the environmental causes. We'll start with vitamin A deficiency, but there's more. I'll read again the World Health Organization's quote on measles and vitamin A. And they don't really limit it to vitamin A. They say severe measles is more likely among poorly nourished young children, especially those with insufficient vitamin A. It seems logical that poorly nourished young children are probably deficient in a lot of things. Deficient in vitamins, deficient in important minerals, calorie deficient. Children in war zones or famine areas are probably suffering from a lot of concurrent problems. If you're not getting enough food, you're not getting enough of a lot of different nutrients. The WHO goes on to say, measles outbreak can result in epidemics that cause many deaths, especially among younger, malnourished children. All children diagnosed with measles should receive 2 doses of vitamin A supplements given 24 hours apart. This treatment restores low vitamin A levels during measles that occur even in well-nourished children and can help prevent eye damage and blindness. Vitamin A supplements have been shown to reduce the number of deaths from measles by 50%. So it's interesting to note that in the early 20th century, scurvy was considered by a lot of people to be an infectious illness, and so was pellagra. We now know that scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency. Pellagra is a vitamin B deficiency. Is it possible that there's a vitamin A deficiency called measles? The problem with suppressing the discussion of vaccines is that a scientist who said, I want to see if vitamin A alone can explain measles, that you would receive severe pushback. You could lose your job, you wouldn't get grant funding, you wouldn't be able to publish. So scientists know, stay on the right side of the major public health organizations and don't go there. If you don't like the answer, don't ask the question. Another thing that indicates environmental causes is that measles was much more prevalent early in the year. I have a graph from the CDC from 1966, which again is in this article that I will link to. You can't really see, again, the CDC isn't great at producing graphs that are really high quality, but you can clearly see that the peak, which is dramatic, it goes from almost zero towards the end of the year to, for example, in 1958, 160,000 cases by just before the middle of 1958. So in the winter, measles cases dropped to zero, but in the late spring, early summer, they rose to 50,000, 100,000, 150,000 cases. It's also interesting that on this graph, the CDC shows the licensing of the first vaccine in 1963, and then the next year, a higher peak in measles cases before it started to go down, and then they don't show the 2 years where it went back up again. Another thing that the CDC shows from some of their graphs is that the deaths per 100,000 people from measles were much greater in the southern United States than in especially the Northeast and North Central. The West was somewhat intermediate, but it's dramatically higher in the southern United States. The southern United States is also where they had pellagra epidemics. It's probably the least well-nourished part of the United States, especially at that time. So let's think about this slightly before the middle of the year. Polio, on the other hand, had a peak that was slightly after the middle of the year that correlated with the fruit harvest season. And the alternative theory of polio is that it was pesticides that caused consumption of pesticides on fruit that caused the polio epidemics. And so late in the year, when fresh fruit was coming to market, a small child may be picking out on strawberries that hadn't been properly washed by the farmer, or the farmer had sprayed pesticides too late because, of course, it's what the strawberries look like that's more important than their nutritional content. That could have caused paralysis in a small child. Adults, being bigger and perhaps more moderate in their consumption of fruit, would have been more protected. So the paralysis, if this theory is accepted, the paralysis would be due to pesticides later in the year. So one would think that measles epidemics, if it was really infectious, would occur in September. All these children come back to school. All of a sudden, every child in America is in a classroom with 10, 20, 30 other children, in a school with hundreds of other children. The mixing is intense. That is when you would expect measles epidemics to occur. But no, they occur in March, April, May, that part of the year. Why would that be? Well, one possibility is at that time, when it was harder to get fruit from all around the world, fruit and vegetables from all around the world, that is the time of the year where people would be less well nourished, because before the new crops started to come in, people's nutritional status would probably be at the lowest at the end of the winter. Just a theory. Obviously, it would be dangerous to go and investigate that, and it would be impossible to go back to the 1950s and look at that. But maybe somebody was doing vitamin A experiments back in the 1950s, and we can see the vitamin A levels were lowest in the spring, rose throughout the summer, and then started to decline in the winter. So it is plausible that vitamin A deficiency and possibly other deficiencies could contribute to measles deaths in the United States. Today, we can get fresh fruits and vegetables from all around the world at any time, but that was not the case in the United States, and it's still not the case in the poorest part of America, which are not necessarily regions, but ghettos. Areas where there are a lot of poor people are notorious for not having good access to fresh fruits and vegetables. It's not that poor people don't want to eat them, it's just in those areas it's very difficult to get them. Now, everybody knows that I live in Canada, and although sometimes Canadians feel like what's happening in the US is always more important than in Canada, the CDC in a 1976 issue of MMWR, had a nice graph of reported cases of measles in Canada between 1924 and 1975. What struck me immediately is that there was a gap in the graph between about 1959 and 1968. What's all this about? And there's a little note on the graph that says not reportable. So the CDC says measles has been officially notifiable in Canada since 1924, with the exception of a 10-year hiatus from 1959 to 1968. Why did Canada stop reporting measles cases in 1959? Measles incidence had dropped in the preceding 4 years, but it actually was not the lowest it had ever been in terms of the number of cases. And it had dropped in the past and then risen to much higher levels. So could it be that by 1959, measles was considered a mild illness that was not of public health significance and therefore not worth public resources to monitor? Certainly, if measles was considered a threat in Canada, it was certain that they would have continued to count cases. And why did they start reporting measles again in 1968? Well, I'm sure you all remember that in 1968 is when the second vaccine came out. Maybe now that they thought, well, we finally got a good vaccine. I pointed out it's the vaccine that's still in use today. And maybe they needed the statistics to be able to push people towards vaccination. If they can report in the newspapers that, there's 10,000 cases of measles in Canada this year, that would scare parents into getting their children vaccinated. So there are those who will never vaccinate and those who will go out on the first day the vaccine's available. But there's probably a lot of parents that don't really care that much, but they can be motivated by fear and harassment through advertising and things like that. The CDC also reports on this little article on Canada that since the mid-1960s, when measles vaccine became generally available, measles incidence has been reduced to approximately 20% of the levels of the 1950s. This is an interesting statement because there's no data from a good part of the 1950s and the early 1960s. And how can they say from the mid-1960s? To me, mid-1960s, 1965, they didn't have data until 1968. Furthermore, after 1968, there was a rise in measles incidence afterwards, in 1969, I guess, before it fell again. So the application of the 1968 measles vaccine was associated with a rise in cases for at least 1 year. We don't know what the incidence for 1967 was. Finally, the CDC reports the number of measles deaths in Canada has declined in the past 25 years as the incidence of measles has been reduced. So this was reporting 1975 statistics. So that would mean that measles deaths have been declining since 1951. If the pattern followed the US, which is likely, they probably had been declining for at least half a century by that point. Additionally, this means that they're admitting that measles deaths declined from about 1951 to 1962 without a vaccine being in place, or between 1951 and 1968 if you agree that the 1963 vaccine was not very effective. And over the period 1951 to 1975, there was a rise in cases in 1955 compared to 1954, and then a blank between 59 and 68. So if they were interpolating a straight line from 1959 to 1968, which would admittedly be stupid, then they would be saying that measles incidence was declining from 1955 to 1963 without a vaccine. Unfortunately, I don't have death statistics for Canada. Maybe one of these days I'll come across where those are. I hope that this little summary of the measles issues with some real numbers helps you understand that the whole measles thing is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than you hear in the news, where just go get your vaccine or this deadly disease, measles, might come out and get you. As an aside, I was interested in this one Twitter account that came after me at one point, Twitter UK. I was interested because it seemed so careful to hide the identity of the person or people behind it. The Twitter account had not even the name of a city, like many Twitter accounts did, and no description. It linked to a Facebook page that similarly had no information about who was behind the Twitter UK. I think it was called, not Vaccine UK, I think it was called Vaccine Truth UK was the Facebook account, and Vaccine UK was the Twitter account. There was a domain name as well, but it just linked to Facebook, so it looked like there was no information. But there's always the Internet Archive, which keeps snapshots of websites going into the past. And in the past, the domain name that I found had actually been a blog, and the contents of the blog were available, and it indicated that there was a man named Jeff who ran the blog. There was nothing else on the blog that gave any information about who this person was, what they'd studied in university, what kind of work they did, whether they were associated with a pharmaceutical company. So I pursued it a little further. This man, Jeff, said that I'm interested in computer games and linked to his game website. But again, he only gave his first name. But it's funny how information leaks out. He'd sold a couple of games through a website, and the form for selling his games included an address. And when I did a Google search on the first name Jeff and this address, I discovered that he was on the condominium board for his house. And from that, I was able to determine that this man was a patent attorney who had studied physics in university. So he seems to have no background in biology or medicine, but somehow obsessively reposts press releases, pro-vaccine press releases, anti-vaxxer screeds, and things like that. Spends a tremendous amount of time doing this for reasons that I don't fully understand. Maybe there is a conflict of interest in there somewhere. I thought maybe he was working on medical patents, but on the list of patents that he talked about on his LinkedIn page, another thing that I found, they were all in areas that were nothing to do with medicine in general, let alone vaccines specifically. Thank you for listening to episode 213 of The Infectious Myth. If you have a comment, question, or suggestion for a future guest, please email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. Like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram @infectiousmyth. Commit to monthly donations of any amount at patreon.com/infectiousmyth. Until next week, thank you and goodbye.